If you were to unfold a map of northern Italy in the waning years of the 17th century, your eyes would find a swath of land known as Emilia-Romagna. It was a place of contradictions, rich plains stitched with vineyards and wheat fields, yet riddled with old scars from war and plague. The air smelled of ripening grapes in summer and wood smoke in winter. Market squares bustled with merchants selling bolts of silk from Florence, spices from the east, and olive oil pressed in the hills. But beneath the surface of this abundance ran a current of unease, the kind that made old women spit over their shoulders and young men keep knives in their boots. In the spring of 1675, a peculiar murmur began to coil its way through the cobbled streets of a modest town called Montebello. It started at the communal well, where washerwomen scrubbed linen and traded stories under their breath. By midday, it had seeped into the taverns, whispered between mugs of sour red wine. By evening, it drifted up the steps of the church, carried by merchants who lingered longer than usual after Mass. The story was always the same, though its tellers swore they had heard it from someone who knew for certain. It spoke of a woman, Isabetta D'Albrizzi, the widow of the late Count Lorenzo, who lived alone in the castle on the hill. And it claimed, with the solemnity of those who fear their own words, that she made soap from the flesh of the dead. At first, many laughed. Italy had always been fertile ground for grotesque rumour. In times of famine, there were tales of bakers kneading bread with powdered bone. During plague years, whispers of physicians distilling elixirs from human organs. But this rumour had teeth sharp, deliberate, and biting into the town's sense of security. It came with details that were too consistent to dismiss. A name, a place, and a smell. The name was Isabetta D'Albrizzi, the place Castello Sapone, her ancestral fortress perched above Montebello like a watchful hawk. The smell, that was what made the rumour burrow deep. Not the acrid sting of lye, nor the gentle comfort of lavender or rosemary. No, this was something else. Sweet, cloying, with an undercurrent of metal. It crept down from the castle's high windows on damp nights, curling through alleyways, slipping under doors. Some claimed the scent was strongest on mornings after the town square had hosted an execution. Montebello had its share of public justice, thieves hanged, deserters shot, traitors beheaded. The condemned were usually carted to the cemetery outside the walls, buried in shallow, unmarked graves. But once in a while, under the cover of night, a cart would be seen trundling up the hill toward the castle instead. And in the days that followed, townsfolk swore the air carried that strange perfume again. Those who had lived in Montebello long enough remembered other oddities. The castle's chimneys smoked at irregular hours, sometimes just before dawn, sometimes deep into the night. Heavy barrels were hauled through its gates under canvas tarps, the drivers avoiding even a glance at passers-by. Once, during a summer storm, a lightning strike briefly illuminated the upper windows, revealing what looked like great copper vats inside, their rims glinting gold in the flash before darkness returned. Still, no one dared confront the Countess. Isabetta was no ordinary widow. Her family's reach stretched from Venice to Bologna, her dowry heavy with land and gold. She was said to have friends in the courts of both the Papal States and the Duchy of Modena. To accuse her openly would be to invite ruin not only from her, but from the web of influence she commanded. Yet fear has a way of feeding on itself. Soon children were warned not to wander near the castle walls. Merchants refused to deliver goods there unless paid in advance, and even then they left them at the gate, pounding once before hurrying back down the hill. Fishermen on the river swore that the water below the castle's drainage channels felt warm to the touch, even in winter. The most unsettling part was that no one could say where the rumour began. Some insisted it was the washerwomen, offended that the Countess never sent her linens to be cleaned publicly. Others blamed a drunk soldier who claimed to have seen something unspeakable in the castle kitchens, but the tale was already too big to trace back to a single tongue. It had taken root, woven into Montebello's nightly conversations like the tolling of the church bell. And so the town watched the castle on the hill with the wary eyes one reserves for a predator beautiful from afar, deadly up close. Every flicker of light behind its drapes, every slow turn of its weathered gates, was noted and filed away in the collective memory. For in Emilia-Romagna, beauty and danger often wore the same face, and the people of Montebello were learning to read the shadows as carefully as they read the scriptures. It would be another year before anyone dared act on the whispers. But by then, the scent from Castello Sapone had seeped into their dreams, and the idea that a noblewoman could harvest the dead to make her fortunes fragrant had become less a rumour and more an inevitability. To understand the whispers, one must first understand the woman at their center. Isabetta D'Albrizzi was not born to the hilltop fortress that would one day bear her name in dread. She entered the world in the year 1624, in a tall, narrow house overlooking one of Venice's lesser canals. Her father was a merchant in oils, dyes, and perfumes, substances that stained his fingers in colors no amount of scrubbing could erase. Her mother, the daughter of a glassmaker, possessed the still beauty of someone accustomed to the patience of craft. Isabetta inherited both trades, in a way. From her father, she learned the properties of oils that could soften leather or skin, the scents that lingered and those that vanished in sunlight. From her mother, she inherited an eye for perfection, a belief that beauty was worth any price. She was the youngest of 4, and by 16, it was clear she was her parents' most valuable asset, not merely for her beauty, though that was considerable, but for her mind. She could negotiate with suppliers twice her age without blinking, calculate the margins of a shipment from Alexandria before the ink was dry on the manifest. In 1641, she was married off, though some said, elevated to Count Lorenzo d'Albrizzi, a man nearly twice her age, whose family had governed rich tracts of farmland in Emilia-Romagna for generations. The marriage was a political one, sealing a bond between Venice's merchant class and Montebello's landed nobility. The Castello Sapone became her new home. The fortress rose from the hill like the prow of a great ship, its walls built from pale stone quarried centuries earlier. In summer, the sun turned them the color of bleached bone. In winter, they seemed to drink in the grey. The locals called it sapone, soap, not for its trade, but for the slick rain-polished stones of its courtyard slippery enough to unseat a careless rider. The castle was grand in size but austere in comfort. Its halls echoed with the footsteps of servants, and in the high-ceilinged rooms the firelight barely touched the corners. From the windows, one could see the sweep of vineyards, the dark smudge of forest and, far below, the clustered rooftops of Montebello. For 17 years, Isabetta and Lorenzo played their roles. He hunted, attended councils, and collected tithes. She managed the household, oversaw the harvests, and wrote letters that travelled farther than her husband ever would. They were not a romantic couple, but neither were they enemies. If there was a shadow over their marriage, it was the absence of children, a fact noted by the townsfolk and never spoken of in the castle. Then, in the autumn of 1658, Count Lorenzo died. The official report claimed a hunting accident thrown from his horse while chasing a stag. But the hunters who brought back his body whispered to the stable hands that the wounds looked more like the work of a blade than a fall. The whispers never reached the magistrate's ears, or if they did, they were politely ignored. Widowhood transformed Isabetta. She wore her mourning gowns with such precision they became part of her legend. Always black silk, gloves to the elbow, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She dismissed her husband's steward and took full control of the estate. Debts were called in with cold efficiency. Fields were replanted according to her designs. Grain that had once been sold cheaply in the town was now sent to markets in Bologna and Florence for higher profit. But what unsettled the people of Montebello was not her business acumen, it was her absence from daylight. Isabetta emerged only after sunset, her carriage gliding down the hill without the jangle of harness bells. The oil lamps inside cast her in warm amber, but no one could recall seeing her hands bare, or her face without its careful mask of cosmetics. There were other oddities. Merchants who delivered to the castle spoke of large orders, barrels of lye, sacks of wood ash, amphorae of animal fat arriving at irregular hours. The deliveries were unloaded by a small staff of silent servants, most of them strangers to the town, their accents unplaceable. When asked, they claimed to be from the coast, and nothing more. The timing of these deliveries often coincided with disappearances. A vagrant here, a beggar there, the occasional debtor who had been seen arguing in the market. No bodies were found, but the town's rumour mill noted the pattern. Some blamed the war to the north. Soldiers came and went, and men vanished in their wake. Others pointed to the plague that still smouldered in certain villages. But there were those who began to connect the barrels, the missing people, and the ever-present scent that curled from the castle's chimneys on damp nights. By the early 1672, Isabetta's name had become a kind of talisman in Montebello. To speak it aloud in the marketplace was to invite silence from those around you. Yet behind shuttered windows, the conversations grew bolder. They spoke of the widow's unchanging face, her skin as luminous as the day she arrived from Venice. They spoke of the way her gloves never seemed worn, though she must have owned them for decades. And they spoke of her baths, hot water carried up in copper urns, sometimes in the middle of the night, by servants straining under the weight. One old washerwoman swore she had seen a smear of red in the water dumped from the castle's drains at dawn. A butcher claimed he was once offered coin for meat without bone, an order he refused without asking questions. And so the fortress on the hill ceased to be simply a noble's residence. In the minds of the people, it became something else, a sealed world where the rules of ordinary life did not apply, where wealth and beauty were fed by unseen fires, and where, perhaps, the dead were not allowed to rest. They did not yet call it the Soap Castle. That name would come later, after events too dark to undo. But the ground was being prepared, the rumour was taking root, and Montebello was beginning to see its widow not as a grieving noblewoman, but as a figure in a much older kind of tale. The first to speak openly of what lay beyond the gates of Castello Sapone was a travelling friar, sent by his abbey to collect tithes owed by the D'Albrizzi estate. His name was Brother Matteo, a thin man with eyes like wet slate and a cough that never quite left him. In the taverns of Montebello, he would later be remembered for a single trembling sentence: "The air inside is not of this world." Those who pressed him for detail heard fragments rooms swaddled in shadow, the hiss of steam behind locked doors, the sound of liquid folding over itself in heavy copper vats. He spoke of a scent so intoxicating it made his head swim, a perfume that clung to his robes for days. And then there was the glimpse, fleeting but seared into his memory. An arm, pale and human, slipping beneath the surface of a bubbling mixture before a servant slammed the lid shut. 3 days after returning to his abbey, Brother Matteo was found face down in the Po River. The current carried him nearly 20 miles before the fishermen pulled him ashore. His death was ruled an accident. In Montebello, no one believed that. If the friar's tale was dismissed by some as the delirium of a sick man, the events of 1676 left no such room for doubt. That year, the plague returned to Emilia-Romagna with a vengeance. It moved slowly at first, like the shadow of a cloud passing over the land, then struck with sudden ferocity. Within weeks, the bells tolled daily in Montebello. Bodies were wrapped in linen and carted to the charnel pits beyond the walls. The living crossed themselves when the carts passed. Yet more than once, those carts laden with their grim cargo were seen turning not toward the cemetery, but toward the winding road that climbed to the castle. At first, it was said the Countess had offered to bury certain victims in her family's crypt, a gesture of charity. But the pattern was troubling. The plague carts that went up the hill often carried bodies too fresh, too untouched. It was a soldier, Marco Bellanti, who noticed. He had been posted along the plague routes, tasked with ensuring the disease did not spread between villages. He saw the carts pass, saw the bodies, men in their prime, women without a mark of sickness. And one morning, he saw a face he knew, his cousin, Luca, a mason's apprentice. Luca had not been ill. He had been drinking in the tavern just 2 nights before. Bellanti followed the cart at a distance, keeping to the trees. When it reached the castle, the gates swung open without question. Servants unloaded the bodies onto wooden stretchers and carried them inside. The gates closed. The road returned to silence. Within a fortnight, Bellanti went to the magistrate. Whether out of outrage or vengeance, he told everything he had seen. The magistrate, a cautious man with debts to the D'Albrizzi name, hesitated. But the plague was thinning his ranks, and the whispers were growing too loud. A decision was made. On a fog-heavy morning, the magistrate and a detachment of soldiers climbed the hill. The gates of Castello Sapone resisted, then yielded with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with heat and a sweetness that made the stomach turn. The great hall was empty save for the Countess herself, seated at the head of a long table, her gloved hands folded. She greeted them with a calm smile. The search began. In the kitchens they found copper vats still warm from the fire. One was half filled with a creamy off-white substance cooling to a skin. Another was dark and viscous, the scent almost floral. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with bars of soap wrapped in silk and stamped with the D'Albrizzi crest. It was a soldier, perhaps inexperienced, perhaps too curious, who unwrapped one of the bars and, on impulse, cut it clean in half. Something fine and brown curled from the cross-section, embedded in the substance. Hair. Human. The magistrate's ledger records little from that day, save for one line written in a cramped hand. The fragrance clings to the hands long after washing. Isabetta did not resist arrest. She rose, smoothed her gown, and allowed herself to be escorted to a carriage. In the town square, where the people had gathered in a tense, shifting crowd, she turned her head and said, softly but clearly enough for those nearest to hear, "Is it not better to give the dead a second life than to let them rot in the earth?" Her trial in Bologna was a spectacle. Witnesses came forward, merchants who had delivered barrels of lye in the dead of night, servants who had carried water to her baths, neighbours who had traced the smell from the castle to their very doorsteps. The prosecution laid the bars of soap before the court, their scent unmistakable even across the chamber. Yet conviction proved elusive. Too many of the magistrates owed favours to her family. Too many feared the shame of admitting they had accepted her hospitality, her gifts, perhaps even her wares. In the end, the verdict was exile, not execution. On the morning she departed, Montebello stood silent. From the windows of the taverns and the steps of the church, the people watched her carriage vanish into the mist. No one waved, no one spoke. Only the faint trace of her fragrance lingered in the air, curling through the streets long after she was gone. After her carriage vanished into the morning fog, Montebello expected the castle to fade into silence. For a time, it did. The gates remained shut, the windows dark. Ivy began its slow conquest of the walls, curling into the cracks, draping the stone in green. Rain pooled in the courtyard, and the once burnished doors swelled and warped in their frames. But absence is not the same as forgetting. The people of Montebello could not ignore the shadow the fortress still cast over their town. Children dared each other to climb the hill, only to bolt at the first creak of a branch. Farmers crossing the fields swore they sometimes saw a pale light gliding from room to room in the upper floors, as though someone still paced there by candle. And on certain damp nights, when the wind came down from the hill, the air carried that same unplaceable scent, sweet, almost pleasant, yet tainted with something metallic. The castle's doors were not opened again until a decade later, when the estate was sold to a minor noble from Parma. His first order was to inventory the contents. The servants sent to the kitchens returned pale-faced. The copper vats remained, greened with verdigris but intact. On a high shelf, they found a small cedar chest, sealed with wax. Inside were 24 bars of soap, each wrapped in yellowed silk, each stamped with the D'Albrizzi crest. The new owner sent the soap to Florence, as curiosities for a friend, a perfumer of some renown. That perfumer's notes still survive in a private collection. He wrote of a fragrance unlike any in the world, a paradox of sweetness and iron, as though spring flowers bloomed in the shadow of a forge. He kept 1 bar under glass. Centuries later, it is said the scent has not faded. As for Isabetta D'Albrizzi, her trail dissolved into speculation. One version of the story claims she fled to the Ottoman court, where her knowledge of oils and scents won her favor among the Sultana's household. Another insists she returned to Montebello in disguise, living out her days in a modest house by the river, selling herbal remedies in the market. A third whispers that she never left at all, that she simply moved into the unused wings of her own fortress, walking the halls unseen, waiting for the world to forget her. The truth may be beyond reach, but the legend has only grown. Travellers passing through Montebello often hear the story from the innkeepers, told in low voices by the hearth. Some claim to have purchased old soap at estate sales in Bologna or Ravenna, only to find themselves haunted by dreams, strange, vivid dreams of candlelit rooms and gloved hands working over steaming copper. There are even those who believe the castle is cursed. They say anyone who keeps a bar of D'Albrizzi soap will find its fragrance subtly changing over time, becoming more personal, more familiar, until one day it smells unmistakably of someone they have lost. The Castello Sapone still stands. Its stones are weathered, its battlements sag, and the ivy has all but consumed the north wall. Yet from certain angles, it remains beautiful. Like its mistress, it wears decay as though it were just another form of elegance. If you go there, the locals will tell you not to linger. The air grows heavy on the hill, and the silence is never quite complete. You might hear the faint stir of water in a vat, the slow fall of liquid over wood, the echo of a footstep that does not belong to you. And if the wind shifts, you may catch a scent, sweet, cloying, touched with iron, that makes the hair rise on your neck. Perhaps it is only the memory of a rumour, carried on the breeze. Or perhaps the soap castle, in its way, still works, still transforms, still gives the dead their second life. And if that is true, then the woman who once ruled it, the widow in black silk with the unlined skin, is not gone. She is only waiting.